March is madness, there's noise everywhere, people talking, TVs blaring, birds screaming like they've got a personal vendetta against you. Those bastards. But you know what shuts all of that out? Raycon's everyday earbuds with active noise cancellation, because sometimes you just do need a little peace. Yes, please, who doesn't? But I've got peace from my silent studio right now, but they are nice when I go outside. Not only do these block out distractions, but they also fit like a dream. They are comfortable, they are secure, great for workouts, great for commutes, or just maybe just ignoring your roommates. Plus, 32 hours of playtime and a quick charge feature that gives you 90 minutes of juice in just 10 minutes. My personal favorite, wireless charging case. It's compact, it's sleek, it's a lifesaver when you're on the go. Also, colors. I originally had mine in black, but now they do this fantastic case, which makes it, this is kind of like a marble-ish looking texture. It protects it, it feels fantastic, it's nice and soft. You can't go wrong with Raycon. So just go to buyraycon.com/intotheshadows to grab your own Raycon everyday earbuds and get 20% off. That's buyraycon.com/intotheshadows. And now today's video. South Africa's cities have long carried the reputation of being crime hotspots. Many crimes are committed by organized crime syndicates and street gangs, and in Cape Town, gangs like the Americans, mongrels, fancy boys, and hard livings openly clash over turf in the residential areas of the Cape Flats. At the same time, South Africa's prisons are ruled by the Numbers Gang. This year, the organization is estimated to be 135 years old, making it one of the oldest crime organizations in the world. Initially, the Numbers were highway robbers and thieves, but they eventually built a notorious reputation in the old South African Republic's gold mines, townships, and prisons, which they used as bases for their operations. Today, their members hold supreme power over South Africa's prisons, living strictly by a brutal set of rules that governs every aspect of their lives. According to Numbers legend, the original Numbers Gang was founded by three men: Paul Mabazo, Nongoloza, and Nongoloza. They had moved to Johannesburg in the 1880s to work in the gold mines. However, Paul soon realized the black mine workers were treated like cattle, and he decided he wanted no part of it. Instead, he convinced the two others to join him in robbing traveling coaches. Together, they established a base camp in the hills south of Johannesburg. Paul then recruited 15 men and divided them into two groups. Nongoloza was given control of 8 men, while Nongoloza led the remaining 7. Nongoloza and his team were tasked with robbing coaches at night, whereas Nongoloza and his team carried out the daytime robberies. As their leader, Paul wrote the gang's laws onto a rock and then produced a duplicate by pressing the hide of a freshly slaughtered bull onto it. Nongoloza and his men received the bull hide, while Nongoloza and his men were given the rock. This arrangement ensured both groups knew which rules to follow, though legend has it that the latter ended up with only half of the rules when the rock fell and split into two. According to the oral histories of the Numbers, Paul died 2 years later. Soon after, Nongoloza and his men discovered that Nongoloza and his gang members were regularly engaging in group sexual activities. Disapproving of this practice, Nongoloza's group decided to break ties with Nongoloza's. Nongoloza and his 7 men then began calling themselves the 27s, while Nongoloza started referring to his group as the 28s. Both groups eventually ended up at Point Prison in Durban, where they befriended another Zulu man named Gray. Gray, along with a group of 6 friends, made a living through smuggling goods and gambling. Initially, there was significant conflict between Nongoloza's bloodthirsty 28s and Gray's gang. However, Nongoloza and his 27s worked hard to keep the peace, eventually persuading Gray's gang to join forces with the 28s and 27s. After merging, they began referring to themselves as the 26s. And with that, the Numbers Gang was born. From then on, the 26 gang was always responsible for generating income for the Numbers. The 28 gang served as the warriors, while the 27 gang took on the roles of lawmakers, peacekeepers, and executioners. Yet history remembers their origins somewhat differently. Mzele Mathebula, the man who would come to be known as Nongoloza, was born in the old Zulu kingdom in 1867. He grew up herding his family's cattle, and as a teenager worked as both a gardener and a groom for several white families. In 1886, the 19-year-old Nongoloza had been employed by a Mr. Tom for a month when one of Mr. Tom's horses went missing. Nongoloza set out to look for the horse and explained to Mr. Tom that he had no idea what had happened to it, having spent the day working in the gardens. However, Mr. Tom promptly fired him and insisted that Nongoloza repay him for the loss. To ensure that Nongoloza could repay his debt, he was assigned to work for another white farmer in the area. This farmer would then forward Nongoloza's wages to Mr. Tom until the full value of the horse had been repaid. According to Nongoloza, this amount would represent my wages for about 2 years. I asked my brother whether it was the law and whether he thought it fair that I should work and have my wages kept back for the horse which I did not lose. He told me that I must work or they would put me in a jail and added that he did not want to see me there. I told him that I could not work for what I did not lose." End quote. After a few weeks, Nongoloza's new employer sent him to the recently established town of Johannesburg to make a few deliveries. Seizing the opportunity, Nongoloza escaped, eventually severing all ties with his family. He changed his name to Jan Note, and 2 years later, he found employment as a groom for, quote, 4 white gentlemen. They paid him a generous salary of 30 shillings a week on the condition that he couldn't invite his friends onto their property and he had to keep quiet about whatever he might witness. According to Nongoloza, quoting again, "After breakfast, the 4 men would leave around 8 or 9 in the morning on their horses and return at midday for dinner, staying home until dusk. They would then head out again, not returning until about midnight. They always seemed to bring back some money, and I remember seeing them count it at night." The quote ends. Before long, they invited Nongoloza to join one of their trips, and he was shocked to learn that his employers were actually members of a notorious gang of highwaymen. He watched as they robbed passengers on coaches traveling between Johannesburg and Pretoria of all their valuables and posed as police officers in order to rob black mine workers of their weekly wages. When Nongoloza was offered a position in someone else's gang, he refused because he didn't want to be subservient. Instead, he decided that he could become rich by starting his own gang. In 1890, he joined forces with 2 black criminals, Paul Nolopa and Nalaka, both of whom had grown frustrated with the treatment of black migrant mine workers and had turned to crime to support themselves. The 3 established a base in the hills south of Johannesburg and began recruiting petty thieves, armed burglars, vagrants, and other criminals into their gang. Within a year or 2, the group swelled to around 200 members who all found shelter in the abandoned mine shafts and caves scattered across the hills. The gang was led by Nolopa, with Nongoloza serving as his indunya, or commander. In 1892, Nolopa was arrested for robbing a tailor's shop and he was sent to prison. It's not clear how long his sentence lasted, but upon his release, he claimed to have found God and announced his new mission to preach the word of God to the other blacks living in Johannesburg. With Nolopa out of the picture, Nongoloza assumed control of the gang and transformed them into his own little army. Inspired by the great king Shaka Zulu, he assigned specific roles to each of his men and organized them according to the ranks used by the Boer commandos, who had been protecting white-owned farms and towns for nearly 200 years. According to Nongoloza, quoting, "I myself was the Nkulu, or king. Then I had an Ndula Nkunu-styled lord and corresponding to the governor-general. Then I had another lord who was looked upon as the father of all of us and styled Nonsala. Then I had my government, who were known by numbers, number 1 to number 4. I also had my fighting general modeled on the Boer general. The administration of justice was entrusted to a judge for serious cases and to a magistrate for minor ones. Medical services were assigned to a chief doctor or traditional healer. Additionally, I appointed colonels, captains, sergeant majors, and sergeants to lead the rank and file, the soldiers." Nongoloza would later call his gang the Ninevites after the biblical state of Nineveh, whose people had rebelled against God. They were also known as the Regiment of the Hills. Before long, they made a name for themselves in the City of Gold, not only as a band of thieves and robbers, but also as a modern group of merry men fighting for social justice. In June 1896, The Star reported that, quote, "When a black man has a grievance to redress, for instance, when his master withholds his wages, he makes his complaint to the Regiment of the Hills. Some of its members are then dispatched to confront the offending master, even to the point of knocking him on the head. They do so because Johannesburg is a town without law." There's also some truth to the old numbers legend that Nongoloza encouraged his men to have sex with one another. According to his biography, Nongoloza realized that the women flocking to their base camp south of Johannesburg were bringing several sexually transmitted diseases with them. When the first venereal disease clinic opened in Johannesburg, Nongoloza banned the women from his camp, ordered his men to steer clear of the sex workers in the city, and instructed his traditional healers to treat the myriad sexually transmitted infections that were affecting his men. When his gang members began complaining about the lack of willing women in their camp, Nongoloza reportedly told them that if they felt the need to shove their diseased stick somewhere warm, they could always turn to one of their fellow gang members instead. He then decreed that the older gang members of the marriageable age could take the younger members as their boy wives, thereby kicking off the 28th tradition of taking a boy wife, or wifey, to satisfy their sexual urges. In October 1899, when the Second Boer War broke out, black migrant workers left Johannesburg en masse. For their safety, Nongoloza allowed his men to leave as well, effectively disbanding the Ninevites. However, because he still owed a debt to Mr. Tom, Nongoloza knew he couldn't return to his family. Instead, he and 4 of his most trusted men stayed behind, preying on the handful of people still traveling to Johannesburg. After attempting to rob mine workers on a mine compound in November 1899, Nongoloza and his 4 men were arrested, found guilty, and sentenced to 5 years of hard labor and 25 lashes. However, with war underway and manpower in short supply, the Boer authorities ordered their release just a few months later. In March 1900, as the British Army rapidly advanced toward Johannesburg, Nongoloza and his men encountered a patrol of special constables on the lookout for the approaching enemy. Gunfire erupted between the two groups. Following the skirmish, Nongoloza was rearrested and charged with attempted murder. He was subsequently sentenced to 7 years of hard labor and 30 lashes, serving time in a prison outside Pretoria. There, Nongoloza was joined by several members of the Ninevites who were already serving time for other offenses, and before long, he began drawing the attention of the prison wardens. Whenever he entered a room, the other inmates would chant Bayede, a greeting typically reserved for Zulu royalty. They also gifted him food, tobacco, or weed, and while working in the stone quarries, Nongoloza could be seen holding court beside specially marked stones. Following the end of the war, in May 1902, the mines reopened, and gradually the other members of the Ninevites began making their way back to Johannesburg. It was there that the pass laws introduced by the new British administration started to work in Nongoloza's favor, since any black man who wasn't gainfully employed and didn't own a pass risked arrest and imprisonment. This meant that Nongoloza was once again reconnected with his loyal gang members. As they cycled in and out of prison, they began recruiting more men. And before long, the Ninevites evolved into, quote, an organization which now reached out to embrace prison, mine compounds, and black townships alike. By 1912, estimates put the Ninevites at nearly 1,000 members. Spread all over the Witwatersrand, they had successfully infiltrated the mining compounds and established a notorious reputation in the black townships, where they frequently preyed on black mine workers. The government of the newly established Union of South Africa recognized, albeit too late, that a brutal criminal organization had flourished right under their noses. In a bid to dismantle this threat, they did everything they could to break Nongoloza, clinging to the old adage that cut off the head of the snake and the body will die. It was during this period that Nongoloza began advocating for better treatment of inmates, while the Ninevites turned their anger on the wardens who mistreated the prisoners. Between July 1900 and 1912, Nongoloza appeared in court on numerous charges, attempting to escape from prison, successfully escaping, possessing contraband, attacking a warden, and inciting acts of violence. Over those 12 years, he received up to 170 lashes as punishment for his alleged crimes. Yet every time he came before the court, Nongoloza would loudly protest the inhumane conditions that his fellow prisoners endured. He recounted how he was sometimes starved for days as punishment for imagined slights, and detailed the brutal treatment inflicted by the prison wardens, going so far as to name them publicly. His impassioned accounts didn't fall on deaf ears. When Jacob Bruce was appointed as the new director of prisons in 1908, he made it his mission to get to know Nongoloza and better understand the profound influence the man wielded over the prison inmates in the Transvaal. In 1912, Nongoloza was offered a deal by the prison authorities. Retire as the king of the Ninevites, work with them to dismantle the prison gangs, and in return, they would buy him his very own farm in the kingdom of Swaziland so that he could live in peace. Nongoloza agreed, dictated his life story to a prison warden, and on December 24th, 1914, he was released. Over the next 2 years, Nongoloza worked alongside the authorities to put an end to the Ninevites. He was sent to various mines in Johannesburg and later to Durban's Point prison to dismantle the last group of the Ninevites. Afterwards, he retired to his small farm in Swaziland, and in May 1917 it was reported that, quote, Nongoloza, once the most dangerous coloured criminal in the world, now holds his head up as a respectable member of his community and a leader amongst native agriculturalists. For the next 30 years, Nongoloza mostly faded into obscurity until his death in 1948, but his legacy continued to live on in South Africa's prisons. It's believed that the ex-members of the Ninevites who were left behind went on to form the Numbers Gang, and during Apartheid, the Numbers relentlessly fought for the rights of inmates in South Africa's prisons. According to the Numbers, life in prison during the Apartheid years was exceptionally harsh, and they spent decades striving for better conditions. Their demands range from improved food, actual beds and proper mattresses, to the freedom to wear wristwatches, and later to access television. They also sought more humane treatment from prison wardens, who had habitually used brutal beatings on black prisoners both as punishment and also for sport. Instead of staging peaceful protests, the numbers made the prisons ungovernable by attacking the wardens and setting prison buildings on fire. The situation deteriorated to such an extent that by the 1980s, prisoners in Pollsmoor Prison were confined to their communal cells while wardens patrolled the hallways armed with attack dogs and spray canisters filled with tear gas. Whenever a member of the numbers appeared in court and was asked to justify their crimes, they would speak out loudly about the inhumane treatment they endured in prison. They recounted how officials would gang up on them and beat them for sport, and described conditions where up to 20 men were forced to share a room designed for only 4. This cruel overcrowding eventually led the Apartheid government to ban journalists and researchers from writing about life in South Africa's prisons. In the years following the end of Apartheid, however, the numbers and their fellow prisoners have been granted more freedoms within their facilities. Several prison directors have even come to realize that it is in everyone's best interest to let the numbers manage their own affairs, because if they aren't allowed to do so, lives will be lost. Over the past 20 years, researchers have conducted numerous studies to gain a better understanding of the numbers and their methods. The ultimate goal of these studies is to address the high levels of violence that have long plagued South Africa's prisons. They have discovered that the numbers are governed by a set of unwritten laws, handed down, changed, and adapted over the last 100 years. They follow military ranks and command structures similar to those used by the Ninevites, with each rank carrying its own set of responsibilities within the prison. In addition, the numbers have developed their own language, known as Sabela, and they use a variety of hand gestures and tattoos to communicate with one another and to identify themselves. The gangs, known as the 28s, 27s, and 26s, consist of an unspecified number of generals, colonels, captains, sergeants, and soldiers. They can be recognized by the tattooed epaulets and badges on their bodies. Each gang also designates an inspector, or glass, whose job is to investigate cases of non-compliance. In the 28s, a lieutenant, also referred to as a Jim Crow, is responsible for relaying information throughout the prison to the 27s and 26s. In addition, the gang has medics to attend to the well-being of its members and judges who oversee matters of internal justice. Quoting again, judges are known as the man without mercy or the man without a heart. If someone is destined to receive the death sentence, the judge will use his black pen to order the execution. But the most important member of the gang is the book. He is the keeper of the law, maintaining a meticulous record of everything that has transpired during his time in the prison. Every rule, every decision, and every action undertaken by the gang is carefully inscribed onto his skin. The language and symbolism used in these records are meant to be understood only by the generals. The 28s are led by a warlord and are responsible for crafting weapons, managing the gang's stockpile of food, drugs, and arms, and defending the gangs. The 27s are considered the most brutal members of the numbers, and they handle teaching new initiates about the gang's history and their roles within it, enforcing its laws, and identifying anyone who steps out of line. Once the judges convene and issue a sentence, the 27s determine who will carry out the sentence and decide on the punishment. The 26ers serve as the grunts of the numbers, tasked with generating income for the gang by selling drugs and weapons and soliciting sex, both inside and outside the prison. They are also responsible for cleaning the hallways, working in the prison kitchens, and ensuring that information flows freely among all gang members. This structure, as described by Andrew Bosch, a former corrections officer at Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town, underscores the multifaceted roles each tier plays in maintaining the organization's operations. Quoting him, "All of the prisoners must be fed every day, and all the food comes from the same place, the kitchen. It is the only location that links every point of the prison with every other, so the food trolleys don't just carry food, they are the prison's telephone lines, transmitting information and instructions. You can't keep the gangsters off the food teams. If you cut off the gang's ability to communicate with other sections, they quickly get nasty." One of the reasons the numbers have been able to exist for so long is that they actively recruit new members almost every day. The only requirements are that the recruits aren't already part of a rival gang and that they have been convicted of a serious crime. End quote. According to Welcome Whitboy, a former general of the numbers, potential members are recruited as soon as they step into the prison. Representatives from the 26s, 27s, and 28s are always present when new inmates arrive, and they decide whom they want to add to their ranks. Once a decision is made, the inspectors from the 26s are sent out to recruit the chosen individuals. Welcome explains that when he first arrived in Pollsmoor Prison after being convicted of kidnapping and attempted murder, 2 prisoners approached him and asked, "Who are you in prison?" He replied, "Welcome." In response, one of the men slapped him hard across his face. When he repeated, "Welcome," the man slapped him again. Standing nearby him was another inmate who was asked, "Who are you in prison?" He answered, "Fransman." Nothing happened to him. Quoting again, "And that means you're willing to join the gang. A Fransman is someone who doesn't know everything, but is open to learning." So when they asked me again, "Who are you in prison?" I said, "Fransman," and nothing happened. I had no idea what I was saying at the time. Only later did it dawn on me that I'd just been chosen to join the 28s. During the first few days in prison, the 27s take the new initiates under their wing and introduce them to the ways of the numbers. They share the history, ranks, language, and rules of the group, and as night falls, the initiates are exposed to the darker realities of membership, the court trials, judgments, and executions. This grim introduction is essential, as the only way a member of the numbers can be pardoned for a crime is by shedding blood, typically that of a corrections officer or a Franzi, a non-gang member. Furthermore, the severity of the offense dictates the weapon used during these rites. A short blade, measuring only about a centimeter and causing only flesh wounds, a long blade capable of inflicting serious injury, or a death blade. Attacking a corrections officer is the only way for a gang member to advance in rank, with the new rank determined by that of the corrections officer they target. The gang also decides whether the corrections officer must die during the attack. Whenever a new initiate is handed a blade, 2 other gang members accompany them to ensure the task is completed. Their role is twofold. They are prepared to murder the initiate if they fail to complete the task, and they ensure that the weapon used in the execution quickly disappears. Logic dictates that if the initiate is left without a weapon, there's no way they could have stabbed or killed anyone. After all, it's not as though they could fatally stab someone with their bare, if now bloody fingers. In many ways, South Africa's prisons are run by the numbers. They decide which prisoners are appointed to certain positions. They help maintain order among inmates. And if a correction officer has earned their respect or is willing to be bribed, their safety behind bars is nearly guaranteed. Experience has taught correctional officers that it is in their best interest to grant the numbers gang a certain amount of freedom if they want to prevent the prison from descending into total chaos. As Andrew Bosch explains, quoting, "Say something terrible happens on D section. Some 28 breaks a serious rule. Now say there is only one 28 judge in the prison and he is on B section. He must be part of the decision. He must have the final say in handing down sentence. So a message passes from D section through the kitchen to B section and the judge is informed of the offense. He thinks about it, sends a message back, and the messages continue passing until the higher structure of the gang has met via messages in the kitchen and a sentence is passed." Now, in this situation, you would say that our task is to keep the sections closed. If the judge can't pass sentence, it can't be carried out. But imagine the kitchen is closed, and the D section makes a decision independently, punishing the offender without the judge's consent. Rumors reach the judge about what happened, leading him to suspect that some gangster within the D section has staged a coup and assumed the power of a judge. Alternatively, the judge might hear that an upstart in the D section has appointed himself treasurer and is hoarding all the money from the drug trade. In either case, the next thing to come from the B section via the kitchen is a knife and an order to kill. So on one hand, you want to keep the sections closed so that the judge can't order a stabbing. But on the other hand, you need to keep the sections slightly open because if they aren't, the judge will undoubtedly order a stabbing. It's difficult to know exactly where the line should be drawn. End quote. In recent years, the numbers gang has undergone an evolution. Cell phone access now enables continuous communication between members inside and outside prison, allowing the gang to once again prey on some of South Africa's poorest communities. One study reveals that street gangs in South Africa currently command a 90% market share of the drug trade, and they are collaborating with crime syndicates from Nigeria, Morocco, and China. Although some of these drugs inevitably enter South African prisons, the numbers have also established bases in the cities. In these urban centers, high-ranking members manage business fronts and keep close tabs on the gang's assets. They've also begun working with well-established street gangs, facilitating the movement of money, drugs, and other contraband into and out of South Africa's prisons. In return, former numbers members, those released from prison, are elevated to leadership positions, offering these gangs a proud history, a secret language, a sense of legitimacy, and an organizational structure in which each rank has its own function and specific role. The structure has significantly contributed to the success of their illicit business. According to researcher Heinrich Verlohen, this phenomenon is being observed worldwide as street gangs reorganize into lucrative prison-based criminal networks. For the past 20 years, South African prison authorities have struggled to put an end to the numbers gang, especially since they are responsible for approximately a quarter to one-half of all management problems within South Africa's prisons. Currently, interventions and programs aimed at mitigating gang activity in correctional facilities have largely failed. Indeed, the fact that the numbers gang has existed for over a century raises serious questions about the effectiveness of these efforts. Nonetheless, Verlohen points out that to stop the numbers, one must first dismantle the street gangs. And if you want to put an end to street gangs, you need to prevent new members from signing up. Since the boys who join these gangs come from impoverished backgrounds and are seeking a sense of protection, safety, respect, and power, achieving this is easier said than done. Welcome Witboy believes that the key to stopping the gangs is to establish processes and support systems for the boys living in the communities where these gangs thrive. They need adults who not only support them and hold them accountable for their actions, but also provide guidance and assistance where necessary. Welcome and other anti-gang activists fulfill this role by stepping in as the father figures that these boys can look up to. But according to Welcome Witboy, quoting, "There's a difference between criminals and gangsters. Criminals are going to rob you and use the money to buy something like drugs. Gangs are sophisticated. They strategize and plan. Do not think that just because people are in prison, they are stupid. The numbers is 135 years old. Imagine the sophistication required to run that kind of organization. So many years of keeping pace with the times. And yet every single day, young kids still get hooked on this, even though we've talked to them about not joining. Parents have been preaching, teachers have been preaching, pastors have been preaching, but we still see our kids joining the gangs. Young boys are searching to become men. Only another man can give a boy the opportunity to become the man he wants to be. Gangs take advantage of that. That is why we always tell parents, be present, be available, and don't throw money at your kids and think it's going to be enough. Thank you for watching.